I want to focus today on the life of a certain man, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was a rabbi who lived in the 1st century. In a sense, it's misleading to say that I want to focus on his life. I want to focus on a number of things that he did. I say it's misleading to say I want to focus on his life because though the man had an extraordinarily profound impact on Jewish life and all subsequent Jewish history, we know very little about him. As far as I know, and perhaps there was some stray Talmudic sources I missed, we don't even know the name of his wife. We know that he had a young child who died. We don't know even the name of that child. We know very few details about him. This, in general, I would say, was not an uncommon thing in rabbinic literature, where biographical data was not something in which great interest was taken. You go back even to the biblical sources, we're told events about people that have significance, but we're not told about a whole series of events that doesn't have an obvious didactic significance. Now, obviously, any person, let's say, with a psychological bent, who might be reading biblical sources, might say, yeah, the things, though, that they think didn't have any particular significance might have had great significance. All we're told about Moses, for example, prior to God choosing him as a prophet, are 3 incidents. An incident where he sees an Egyptian smiting a Jew, and he kills the Egyptian. An incident where he sees 2 Jews fighting with each other, and he tries to make peace between them and is unsuccessful. And an incident in Midian where he sees some non-Jewish men oppressing some non-Jewish women and intervenes on behalf of the women. The next thing that we know, God is now telling him that he's chosen him as a prophet to liberate the Jews. One could perhaps deduce from those 3 episodes that we're being told something about a prophet, that the prophet has an obligation that's universal. He has an obligation to protect Jews from oppression. He has an obligation to try and bring peace between people, and he even has an obligation to step in when non-Jews are oppressing other non-Jews. But clearly we all understand that we aren't told an enormous body of information about Moses. Well, Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai fits into the category. We don't have an enormous body of information, but what we do know about him allows for certain generalizations, and I want to engage in them in speaking about him. I also want to say something else about the nature of the talks I'm giving on Jewish history. It's very hard to teach Jewish history. It's very hard, for example, to write, as many people have tried, a 1-volume history of the Jews. And the reason it's hard is because there's a tendency for it to turn out like a telephone book. In fact, I remember when I was at Yeshiva University, they used as a standard 1-volume history, a history of the Jewish people by Professors Marx and Margolis. And one of the teachers used to jokingly call it the Marx and Margolis telephone directory. And the reason was, in this work, which is a good book, they try in about 600 pages to summarize 4,000 years of history. And how can you summarize 4,000 years of history with so many important names and people, other than by mentioning a lot of names on each page and giving a little information about them? But the question is, how useful then is that information to the person who's reading it? Number one, you're unlikely to remember it. Secondly, if you do remember it, sometimes it's so short that what do you emerge with? Moses Maimonides, medieval Jewish philosopher, the greatest, lived from 1135 to 1204, rationalist, influenced by Aristotle, codified Jewish law, was also a great physician. Okay, so now you know that. But what exactly can you do with that? So it becomes a very, very hard task. Another problem that besets many 1-volume Jewish histories is that they're not written with a clear thesis. So as a result, you're reading a lot of historical material, but it's unrelated, which is, of course, by the way, the problem most of us had as children when we read historical textbooks in school. They were a recitation of facts, but the facts didn't necessarily integrate with each other, and then this happened, and then that happened, and there wasn't a thesis. As a result, what I try to do in teaching Jewish history is to take out, number one, things that correspond to one thesis, which has generally been, how did the Jewish people survive over the last 4,000 years, 3,500 years? How did they survive? What animated their survival? In other words, why did they survive? And secondly, I try also to extract those things that still seem to me to speak to Jews in the modern period. In other words, there are many things in Judaism that were important historical events in their own time. But if they don't seem to still have any significance today, I don't tend to speak about them. It's hard enough just to try and get through the material that still speaks to us today. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai falls into that role. He was a controversial figure in his own time, and he was a man of great common sense, which I think we're all aware common sense is really, after all, not so common. Here's a typical teaching of his. If you should happen, and remember this was a teaching recited in the period just around the time, probably just after the destruction of the temple. So you know the mindset of what was going on in Jewish life. I can't date this teaching. It might have even been before the destruction of the temple. But the mindset was of a people very unified, very desirous of kicking out the Romans, very oriented towards the idea that they were living at the time of the Messiah coming. It's not an uncommon thing for a generation to think that they're living in the, near the end of days. Just turn on your televisions late at night to Trinity Broadcasting on Channel 40, and you get the sense we're living at the end of days. When was the last time you had a rabbi tell you to turn on Trinity Broadcasting? But you turn on any of the Sunday shows, and there's a real sense that we're near the end of days. Rabbi Yochanan taught as follows. If you should happen to be holding a sapling in your hand, when they tell you that the Messiah has arrived, first plant the sapling, then go out and greet the Messiah. I think this statement epitomizes, as I put earlier, one aspect of Yochanan ben Zakkai, his common sense. He reached for the achievable, not for the utopian. While all around him, people were risking everything that they had in expectation of a messianic coming. The Jews had mounted a war against the Romans, that the Jews at that point apparently were not militarily really capable of winning. He resisted this sort of an enthusiasm. Keep planting trees. If you're planting a tree, go on planting it, then greet the Messiah. In other words, skepticism about the Messiah. And there have always been two currents, I would say, not always. In the last 2,000 years, there have been two currents in Jewish life. On the one hand is the current of messianic expectation. We know that there have been Jews who've gone to their death with the Ani Ma'amin. I believe that the Messiah will soon come. I believe with a full heart in the coming of the Messiah. Even though he tarries, I believe he will come. Coupled, on the other hand, with a sense of skepticism about it, there's the story they tell of a man in a shtetl. He's driving by horse and wagon into a shtetl, and as he draws to the outskirts of the shtetl, it's a terrible day. The rain is pouring very hard, and he sees a man standing outside in front of the village. So he stops his horse, and he says to the man, "Come in, I'll give you a ride to the village." The man answers him in Yiddish, clearly also a Jew. He says, "No, I can't leave. I have a job here." He doesn't understand. The guy's literally standing in front of the village gate. He says, "What's your job?" He said, "Well, I'm paid money by the community council to greet the Messiah when he comes." So he says, "The community council pays you? How much money do they pay you?" So he says, "They pay me 1 ruble a week." He said, "That's very low salary." He said, "Yes, but it's very steady work." And so again, the sense of skepticism about the Messiah. Now, this statement of his about to go on planting your tree was apparently not an idiosyncratic statement. It typified his approach. 30 years before the temple was destroyed, in an incident that I've had occasion to mention here, when Caligula decreed that the Jews should erect his statue at the empire, I never really, in speaking of that incident, I never gave the background of how it started. What all of a sudden motivated Caligula to demand that the Jews erect his statue in the temple, since in general the Romans had been fairly respectful about the Jews and their religious practices. Well, what had happened was, basically, the Romans had left the great temple alone. But the Jews, believing that it was an offense before God to have idolatry anywhere in Israel, had destroyed statues of the emperor that were being worshipped by non-Jews in other cities in Israel. And when the word got back to the emperor that they were destroying his altars in the non-Jewish enclaves in Israel, it was then that he said, the only way the Jews now can show to me that they're loyal will be by building my statue and putting it in the great temple in Jerusalem. At the time that they started to destroy, at the time that they destroyed the altar of the non-Jews in the city of Yavne, and so that you not think that the Jews acted in a totally provocative manner, understand there was an ongoing rivalry and tension between the Jews and non-Jews in that city. And the non-Jews had purposely built this altar in a provocative manner near the Jewish part of town. The Jews then destroyed it with the results that I've told you about. At the time that this happened, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, again in his commonsensical manner, said, "Do not destroy their altars so that you do not have to rebuild them with your own hands. Do not destroy their altars that they make out of brick, that they not say to you, now come and build them of stone." And of course he was reacting to what then did happen, with Caligula coming back and demanding that a very impressive statue of his be erected at the temple. The Jews, of course, at that time refused, were willing to go to war at that point, even though they knew that they would lose. Fortunately, Caligula died in a palace revolt at that time. Rabban Yochanan believed that the revolution that the Jews were conducting was not going to win. And he fell into one of the camps. I suppose one could really define that there were three camps of Jews at that time. You had the camp really of people who are just out for peace with the Romans. Some of them even collaborated with the Romans, were tax collectors for the Romans. Clearly religious Jews did not participate in that camp, and the people who were in that camp were viewed with great distaste by the rest of the community. At the opposite extreme, you had the zealots, as they came to be called, Jews, for example, who we know of, the sorts of Jews who were at Masada, but even those people who were more moderate than them, who were in favor of revolt, out-and-out revolt against the Romans. Jewish law did not allow the Jews to be living under subjugation to any other political entity. And in the middle, you had the sages who used to sort of go back and forth. When Caligula decreed that the Jews had to worship his statue, well, at that point they said, that's the bottom line, now we're going to revolt. At other points, when the Romans basically gave them religious freedom, they were willing to tolerate the Romans there. Yochanan apparently was within that camp, and he was skeptical about the revolt. And he, in fact, apparently urged the Jews to surrender, so that you can imagine how he was regarded by much of the Jewish community. The Talmudic tradition gives us a number of episodes reflecting this. In one of them, it's in a Talmudic book called the Avot de Rabbi Natan. It's not that well-known a work. Some of you might have heard of it. It's sort of a Talmudic commentary on yet another Talmudic work, the Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers. And it takes many of the statements in the Ethics of the Fathers and expands on them. And the Avot de Rabbi Natan tells us the following. Now when Vespasian came to destroy Jerusalem, he said to the inhabitants, "Fools, why do you seek to destroy this city? Why do you seek to have your own temple burnt? What do I demand of you? But that you send me one bow and one arrow in sign of submission, and then I shall leave you." The Jews responded to him, "Even as we went forth against the first two who were here before you and slew them," that is the first two Roman generals who they had successfully defeated, "so too shall we go forth against you and slay you." When Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai heard this, he sent for the men of Jerusalem and said to them, "My children, why do you seek to destroy the city? Why do you seek to burn the temple? What is it that they ask of you, the Romans? They ask of you that you give them one bow and one arrow, and then they will leave you alone." In other words, for the sake of the symbolism of the submission, it's worth submitting. And then he did the act which made him truly a controversial figure in Jewish life, and which led many of his contemporaries to regard him as a traitor. When the revolt was going on and it became apparent that the Jews could not win, he urged the leadership of the Jews, who were under siege then in Jerusalem, to surrender to the Romans. The Jewish community, not surprisingly, refused. He called for a secret meeting with a nephew of his, who was one of the leaders of the revolters against the Romans, and he said, "Judaism will be destroyed along with this city. All of the sages of Israel are here, the whole leadership of Judaism. Everything will be destroyed. I want to save Jewish life. Get me out of this city." Said, "How can I get you out? If anybody tries to surrender to the Romans, the Jews will kill him." If any Jew tried to leave the city to surrender to the Romans, he was killed by the people inside the city. He said, "What way is there then for me to get out?" And an elaborate stratagem was worked out, which is recorded in the Talmud. It's a very famous episode. He was put into a coffin and carried out by his students. And normally the procedure was that if a coffin was carried out, they'd stick a spear through the body to make sure that it was not fake. See, because you're not supposed to bury people in the city limits of Jerusalem, so they go right outside the city and bury them. And they said, it'll be terrible if you put a spear through the body of Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's a prominent rabbi, it'll look like a monumental act of disrespect towards the sages of Israel. And so they allowed Rav Yochanan's body to be carried out, whereupon the coffin was taken out of the city. Rav Yochanan miraculously was resurrected, and he got up and he went and he surrendered to the Roman commander. The Talmud records it as being Vespasian. Historically, it would make more sense to assume that by that point already it was Titus, but that's not. I don't want to get into a long scholarly discourse. I remember once reading about a minister who was giving a talk in church, and he was preparing it, and his wife said, "Why are you so excited?" And he said, "Because I'm going to finally prove to the people, to the crowd that has come to hear me, that the Persian reference at the time of Purim is to Artaxerxes II and not Artaxerxes I." It doesn't really matter that much whether it was Vespasian or Titus. Anyway, he went and he surrendered to him. And Vespasian, as the tradition goes, was happy because here he had now gotten a prominent Jewish leader to surrender, and he wanted to take advantage of this surrender, and undoubtedly they did. Undoubtedly they then broadcast to the Jews inside the city, Rabbi Yochanan has surrendered. But he realized that Rav Yochanan had taken a risk by doing so, and he had a sense of gratitude to him for it. And he said, "What do you want from me?" And Rav Yochanan said to him, "Tein li Yavne v'chachameha." Give me the city of Yavne, which is a city about an hour distant from Jerusalem. Today, an hour, of course, by car. Give me Yavne and its wise men. In other words, let me reestablish yeshiva in Yavne. Let me reestablish Jewish religious life in Yavne. It was a small request in many ways. You can imagine from the perspective of the Romans, they didn't feel threatened. It's going to set up a little seminary. What does it matter to them? In fact, in later ages, some of the people were angry at him. Rabbi Akiva, living 50 or 60 years later, said, "A fool. He already had such an opportunity. He had already pacified the emperor. Why didn't he ask them to relent on the siege, to allow it to end?" And the rabbis answered, he knew that they would not accede to a major request, so it was better that he make a minor request and get it than to make a major request and get nothing at all. So that's the request he made, to try and reinstitute Jewish life there. How did the Jews of the time react? Well, we know that even many of his fellow sages, some of whom were fortunate enough not to be in Jerusalem at the time of the siege, some of whom were fortunate enough not to be killed at the end of the siege, thought he was a traitor. And when he reestablished his school in Yavne, for quite a number of years, many of the leading rabbis never showed up there. There's a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Tarfon, never mentioned at Yavne. Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, never mentioned at Yavne. A whole series, all of the priests, never mentioned at Yavne. And in fact, within a few years after he was made head of Yavne, he was ultimately, they put somebody else in his place, a Rabbi Gamliel, and he left Yavne. He had 10 years, approximately, when he was heading the yeshiva, and many doubted him. How then, though, are we to assess him? At the time that it became apparent that the Jews were going to lose to the Romans, there were a number of reactions in Jewish life. Rabbi Yochanan's is the first reaction I described. His reaction is surrender to the Romans, give up national sovereignty, and try and rebuild the institutions of Judaism. But we know that there were other reactions going on in the Jewish community, reactions, by the way, that we probably have more sense of pride in and of empathy with. They're much more dramatic. We had a movie about Masada. I think it'll be a long time before on the American television networks you'll see a 2- or 3-part series on the life of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and the establishment of a yeshiva at Yavne. It somehow doesn't have the same sense of drama. The people at Masada had a radically different response to the events of what had gone on, to the destruction. I was rereading this week Yigal Yadin's book, Masada. Masada, you should know, is an incident we don't know a lot about. How many of you have been at Masada? Oh my, it's an enormous number. Masada has, of course, become one of the great symbols in modern Jewish life. And I'm speaking now praisingly both of what transpired there and of Rav Yochanan, even though they were very opposite. Because I don't think one has to put down one side in order to see the glory of the other. At Masada, I'm sure those of you who were there experienced the same thing I experienced. I was at Masada just again only a few months ago in December. I remember I was in Israel, and Dennis, Janice, and I drove down there one day and went up to the top. And I remember we were up there, and it was at a time of day when there were very few other people present. So we were walking around basically by ourselves. We sat down in one place trying to imagine what it was like. And I remember having a real sense of Jewish otherness, a real sense of being isolated from the world, a real sense of empathy with what they must have felt. Here they were at the top of that hill at Masada, surrounded by the forces that had already destroyed so much of Israel, and I had a real sense of anger and hatred towards a non-Jewish world which has made so many efforts to destroy us. And I understood how Masada had succeeded in becoming such a symbol to the Jews. But by the way, interestingly, it's only a relatively recent symbol to the Jews. Masada was not one of those incidents that throughout Jewish history Jews always spoke of the glory of Masada. In fact, the rabbis don't mention Masada in the Talmud. It's a very puzzling thing. Here is this major episode in Jewish life where 960 Jews commit suicide rather than allow themselves to be taken over by the Romans, and it's not mentioned in the entire Talmudic literature, which is a vast body of literature which mentions so many of the events of the time. Why? Perhaps the rabbis disagreed with the Masada strategy. Perhaps they thought it was not an appropriate model to hold up. We do know that Jewish law is very negative towards suicide. And also, the model of destroying, wiping out Jewish society so that it not fall into the hands of the Romans has sort of frightening implications. Perhaps the rabbis did sympathize with it, but they didn't want to get the Jews thinking in those terms again. They didn't want to hold them up as heroes, because then another young generation of Jews would be raised on the story of Masada and would once again set off in a Don Quixote-type battle to try and destroy the Romans, even though the Jews couldn't. And remember, as devastating as the destruction of the revolt of 66 to 70 was, only 60 years later the Jews revolted again under Bar Kokhba in a revolt which ended up doing far more damage to Israel and being far more destructive. So the people who fled to Masada obviously fled there and knew that the rest of Israel had fallen, and they were there alone. How do we know about Masada if it's not recorded in the Talmud? Because it's recorded in Josephus' history of the Jewish war. There was no group that Josephus was more at odds with than the people at Masada, yet nonetheless he does paint them sympathetically when he describes what happened to them. Masada, though, entered modern Jewish consciousness not so much through Josephus' writings. It's not like every Jew, has read the Jewish wars, but because an Israeli Jewish poet around the turn of the century wrote a poem about Masada, and this poem then became very popular in the rising Zionist circles, and the expression Masada shall not fall again became very much a symbol of Jewish resistance. How, by the way, did Josephus write the story of what happened at Masada? I'm sure that question occurred to almost everybody when they either read about Masada for the first time or saw it on TV. If presumably everybody committed suicide at Masada, how do we know what happened? How do we know what led to their decision to commit suicide? How do we know what Elazar ben Yair said to the Jews before they committed suicide? Josephus claims that he actually got the information in a direct manner. That among the 960 Jews at Masada, there were 2 women who did not commit suicide, and also a number of small children. And Josephus claims that he spoke to these women. Now, we know that ancient historians had tremendous poetic license that they allowed themselves in constructing speeches. But Josephus knew enough about them so that we can imagine that there was a lot in his speech that probably was said in that form or another. And this is how he writes. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but selections. However, neither did Elazar once think of flying away, surrendering, nor would he permit anybody else to do so. Right away, we're aware that we're dealing with the polar opposite reaction of a Yochanan ben Zakkai, who would say, you know what, if we can't win the war, let's surrender to the Romans. Elazar ben Yair's reaction was the opposite. When he saw their wall burnt down by the fire and could devise no other way of escaping, setting before their eyes what the Romans would do to them, their children and their wives, he consulted about having all of the Jews slain. And then he gathered his leaders and spoke to them as follows. Since we long ago, my generous friends, resolved never to be servants to the Romans, nor to anyone other than to God himself, while we formerly would not undergo slavery, even though then we could be subjected to the Romans without danger, we now must do this once again. We were the very first that revolted from them. We are now the last who fight against them. It is now in our power to die bravely in a state of freedom. And he then goes on to speak about God's will that they should die. He notes, the same God who in old took the Jewish nation into his favor has now, however, condemned the Jews to destruction. Had God continued favorable to our cause, he would not have allowed so many people to have been destroyed by the Romans. He would not have allowed the city of Jerusalem to be burnt, to be demolished by our enemies. We are now openly deprived by God himself of all hope of deliverance. The fire which has now destroyed our wall did not turn back against us by accident. It was sent to do so by God. And therefore, he says, God has left the Jewish people. We have no hope of defeating the Romans. Let us therefore all die. He makes a point, let's destroy anything that we have that the Romans would want. Let's destroy all of our wealth, and etc. Let us spare nothing but our food. For that then will be a testimonial when we are dead, that we were not subdued for want of necessities, but that according to our original resolution, we preferred to die rather than to have slavery. It now appears, he goes on to say, that God has made a decree against the whole Jewish nation that we are all to be deprived of life. And he goes on and on. I cannot wish but that all Jews, all of us, had died before we had seen Jerusalem demolished by the hands of our enemies. Let us all go out of this world then in a state of freedom. This is what our law commands us to do. In other words, there was one theme underlying the speech of Elazar ben Yair. The time has come for the Jewish people to end. The only world that we can still remain a part of is a world that destroys us, is a world that humiliates us, is a world totally at odds with our religion, and if that's the only sort of world we can stay alive in, it is better that we go and die. Does it sound preposterous? In many ways, yes. Does it sound understandable does it seem understandable that the rabbis didn't want to reprint the story of Masada in the Talmud? Yes. On the other hand, is it fully preposterous? I can empathize with it. Imagine a terrible scenario, and I won't dwell on it, but you can understand what I mean. Imagine that the state of Israel were now destroyed. After the shock of the Holocaust, the destruction of Israel, would that not in turn cause many Jews to want to just stop being Jewish? Now, the nature of the response that many Jews would have might be different. For them, they were sufficiently religiously inclined and solely Jewishly motivated that the option of assimilation into pagan life was not at all an attractive option. One, of course, could look at Elazar ben Yair's speech and say, look, Elazar, you're right. God has deserted you. It means that you've based your entire life on a false premise. There is no God over Judah, or if there was such a God, he no longer has a covenant with Judah. Therefore, there's no reason to commit suicide. Convert. But obviously, this was not an option for them. But what would happen if, God forbid, Israel were destroyed? I think many Jews would want to stop being Jewish. Some would assimilate and convert. Others, I don't know. I don't know what my reaction would be. I know that assimilation would not be an option, because would I want to go over into being part of the world that brought about Israel's destruction? The internal anger and extraordinary anger that any committed Jew would feel inside, not only against God, but against the world that had brought about such a destruction, would make it impossible to convert into that world. Perhaps we'd be left as a group of discontents going around trying to devoting our lives to avenging those who had brought about such a destruction. And perhaps many would say, it's simply better to die. We don't know, but I understand what motivated people like Elazar ben Yair. What about the rest of the Jewish people? Most Jews, on the one hand, who had participated in the revolt, did not want to die and did not want to commit suicide. They were, in that sense, not willing to follow the counsel of Elazar ben Yair. On the other hand, many of them were undoubtedly antagonistic to Yochanan ben Zakkai. They almost felt, yeah, he now wants to continue like nothing happened. He's going to set up the yeshiva in Yavne. He'll start convening a Jewish high court there, and it'll be as if nothing had happened. and many Jews fell into a state of depression. We all know what the phenomenon of depression is. Basically, depression is a state of mind when you conclude that there is nothing you can do to affect your life anymore. Depression, from that sense, really is a deep religious sin. I mean, not that I would particularly use that in dealing with somebody who was depressed. I don't think it would be of great help. But it is the ultimate sin because it's the statement that you no longer have free will, that nothing you do any longer makes any difference. And it is not surprising that depression typified the reaction of many Jews. Look what had happened. Their temple was destroyed. Their temple, our temple. The temple was destroyed, God's dwelling place that was thought indestructible. The priests, the high priesthood was ended, the institution of a man who represented the Jews before God. Jerusalem, the city where Jews were unified by the pilgrimages that used to take place there, which had been thought also to be indestructible, has now been laid waste. And the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court, no longer had authority. And the Talmud records to us a common reaction of many Jews. Our rabbis taught, when the temple was destroyed the second time, large number of Jews became ascetics, binding themselves not to eat milk, nor to drink wine, not to eat meat, nor to drink wine. Rabbi Joshua, who was a student of Yochanan ben Zakkai, and therefore shared his conviction that the Jews should go out towards the Roman world and make accommodations, confronted them in a conversation and said to them, "My friends, why do you not eat meat? Why don't you drink wine?" And they answered him, "Shall we eat meat which used to be brought as an offering at the altar of the temple, now that the altar is no longer in existence? Shall we drink the wine which used to be poured as a libation on the altar, but no longer exists?" And Rabbi Joshua said to them, "If that's so, we should no longer eat bread, because the bread offerings, the meal offerings, have ceased." They said, "You're right, then we'll just eat fruit." "If that's so," he answered, "we can't eat fruit either, because after all, the first fruits used to be brought as an offering at the temple." "Then we'll manage with the other fruits," they answered him. But he said, "In that case, you can't drink water, because the ceremony of the pouring of the water on the altar is no longer practiced." At this point, they could find no answer, and he said to them, "My friends, come, listen to me. Not to mourn at all is impossible, for everything has been, so much has been destroyed. To mourn too much is also impossible. And we know it never impose on the Jewish community a hardship which the majority cannot endure. The sages therefore have ordained as follows: a man may stucco his house, but he should leave a little part of his house bare. A person can prepare a full-course banquet, but he should leave out an item or two. Kosher caterers should be familiar with that. A woman should put on all of her ornaments, but leave off one or two. In fact, I didn't even think that was not meant to be funny. In fact, one of the traditions that was established after the destruction of the temple, and which was observed by many Jews, and still actually are supposed to be applicable, is some sense of diminution of joy. Most Jews are aware of only one symbol of that diminution of joy, and that is the breaking of a glass at a wedding. But there are other symbols. They said, always leave a small corner of your house bare. In other words, a constant remembrance that we live in exile and in a world in exile. Don't act in this world as if everything can be perfect. You don't make an overly elaborate meal, they say. Leave out an item or two. In other words, always a recognition that there is some sense of diminution, that there is always a small amount of mourning taking place. The Jewish people were in danger of giving up. Obviously, the attitude of asceticism and of turning from this world would have led to an end of the Jewish people. We could have gone out of existence. It's in light of this that one starts to appreciate the greatness of Yochanan ben Zakkai. And remember, I said earlier, I want to try and relate him to our times. And that's what we have to figure out. We figure it out, by the way, in reactions of Jews, for example, to the Holocaust, from those who said the time has come to stop being Jewish. I knew very well a woman, a Jewish woman, who as a young girl had been baptized by her parents. They were Hungarian Jews who had concluded after the Holocaust that they wanted to make sure nothing like that ever happened to their children. And so they baptized their daughter. Other Jews reacted and said, now more than ever we need a state of Israel. And the movement for Zionism became, during the 30s and after the war, the unifying movement of almost all Jews. It's in this context that we now can start to appreciate what Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai did. He doesn't assume that because the Jews lost the war, God is the enemy of the Jewish people. He concludes that the Romans were stronger than the Jews and that it was a lost battle. He doesn't assume that the only hope for the Jewish people is to now wait for a Messiah to come and save them by supernatural means. He said it before earlier, go on doing little deeds, planting trees. He doesn't assume that the loss of Jerusalem and the temple means the end of Judaism as others did. And we understand what happens. The very man who counseled these ascetics in that manner, the Talmud tells us in a different story, had another conversation. Once, as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was coming out of Jerusalem, Rabbi Joshua accompanied him. And together they beheld the temple and the whole site in ruins. Woe unto us, Rabbi Joshua cried, that this place, the place where the iniquities of Israel were atoned for, is now destroyed. My son, Rabbi Yochanan, said to him, don't be grieved. We have another atonement as effective as sacrifices. And what is this? It is acts of kindness, of loving kindness, as it is said in the prophet Hosea, I desire mercy, not sacrifice.
For the conclusion of this program, please turn over the tape.
In other words, Judaism had ideals that were not found on the earth and which could still be fulfilled. When the battle to save Jerusalem became a lost cause, he didn't conclude that the battle to save Judaism had also become a lost cause. Rabbi Yochanan epitomized an interesting midrash that the Jews had. There's a story told that King Solomon once went to a jeweler and said to the jeweler, give me a ring with a message on it so that I can always look at that message and find something to help me and challenge me. And a few weeks later, the jeweler came back to him and brought him a ring, and on the ring were 3 words in Hebrew, Gam ze ya'avar, this too shall pass. And the Midrash concludes, when things in Solomon's life were very bleak and very sorrowful, and it seemed like there was no hope, he looked at it and he remembered, this too shall pass. And yet when things were very good, and he was very happy, and it seemed like everything was going well, he was also reminded, this too shall pass. In other words, never sanctify one moment, never take one moment and assume that that's the eternity. What, after all, is the message that people in the throes of a depression need? They need to be told, this too shall pass. Now, it's true, when you say it to people who are depressed, their first reaction is, that's what everybody says, and they don't feel it to be true. But we also know that it does happen. It does pass, and that's one of the great things that saves mankind, that we do have an ability to remember, but that we also have an ability to forget, that we won't forever throughout our lives experience the sharpest of pains with the same intensity of hurt that we felt the very first time we experienced it. Because if that was the case, pain would only have the capacity to blot us out, and it wouldn't have the capacity to help us grow. Why are people capable of growing from the experience of pain? Because after the initial shock, they can also learn and draw on other things. There was a French literary critic, Leon Bloy, who said something. He said, there are parts of men's hearts which do not yet have existence, and pain enters into them so that they may have existence. It gives the capacity for some sense of growth. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai understood this too shall pass. At the most horrendous moment, when Jews thought there was no hope, Judaism and the Jewish people had now been destroyed by the Romans, he said, let us start to create and recreate the institutions of Judaism. He was like Jeremiah, who decreed that Babylon was going to destroy Israel. And Jeremiah, during his lifetime, was thought of as a traitor. And yet when his prophecies came true, and everybody then was in despair, he said, don't worry. He bought land in Israel, drew up a contract, and he said to the people, still it shall be heard in the cities of Jerusalem and the outskirts of Jerusalem, the voice of a groom and the voice of a bride. Yochanan and Yirmiyahu had this in common. They both stepped in at a time of crisis when the Jewish people were in danger of going out of existence and brought a message of hope. What was the message of hope of Rabbi Yochanan? That the victory of the Roman soldiers did not mean the victory of the Roman gods, that the Jews still had their Torah. And here we start to realize the genius of something in Judaism. Judaism, as I'm sure you know, and as we've often had occasion to speak of, consists of three significant areas: the Jewish concept of God, the Jewish concept of law, and the Jewish concept of peoplehood. In general, many people think of religion as being very God-oriented. Christianity, for example, is very oriented towards the Trinity, towards God and Jesus, who is, of course, also considered to be God. When a Christian suddenly finds that he no longer can believe in God, or that he has severe doubts, it usually imperils his status as a Christian. He finds it hard to go on being a Christian in a state of doubt. And that's why we've discovered, Dennis and I, and I'm sure many of you, we've discovered in our confrontations with many Christian theologians that they don't doubt. You know, I think it's so odd. There are very few Jews who you'll ever meet who'll say, I don't have doubts about God's existence. I'm sure some of you remember a number of years ago when we did the interview, the forum with Monsignor Jorge Mejia, the Pope's representative on Catholic-Jewish relations. And at one point we said to him, we want to ask you now a personal question. And if you recall what happened, Mejia cut us off and said, oh, you're probably going to ask me if I've ever been in love with a woman, which we weren't going to ask him. I thought that was presumptuous. He thereupon answered that he hadn't been. But the question we wanted to ask was, do you ever doubt God's existence? And he said no. And some of you might recall that Falwell said, Reverend Jerry Falwell said the same thing. He writes it in one interview I have with him. He recalls that since the day in 1952 when he accepted Christianity, he has never had a moment of doubt. Now, one thing that occurs to me is that when God is the central and singular issue in your religion, if you give up on it, you lose everything. And so therefore it's hard to ever concede doubt. Here we see the genius of the Jewish system. Judaism stands on three legs, and sometimes when one leg is a little hard to stand on, you emphasize other legs. Rabbi Yochanan didn't emphasize at his time this was God's will that the temple be destroyed. He didn't emphasize to the Jews, don't worry, God loves all of you, even though you've just seen 1 million Jews murdered by the Romans, even though you've just seen tens of thousands of people sold into slavery, even though you've seen thousands of Jewish women taken as prostitutes, even though, for that matter, you've seen many Jewish men subjected to homosexual prostitution. The people at Masada had reasons to commit suicide. He didn't say that. He didn't emphasize God, because truly he lived at a time when many people felt that God had deserted them. But he emphasized other institutions of Judaism. He emphasized Torah. The institutions of the legal institutions of Judaism, he built up, as we'll have occasion to see soon. Just as the Jewish community responded to the horrors of the Holocaust by emphasizing peoplehood. Under the shock and impact of the Holocaust, peoplehood suddenly became something that every Jew can identify with. Now, I make the point, and I believe that ultimately if Jews don't go back and reclaim the other parts of the tradition, peoplehood ultimately will not in and of itself for a lengthy period of time have the ability to permanently sustain the Jewish people. One needs an animating ideal to motivate the peoplehood. But we understand under the shock that one thing stands out, and that's the thing. That's why Jews can admit to doubt and still go on feeling intensely, passionately Jewish. Because while they're doubting, they're doing other things as well. And therefore they're maintaining their ties with the community. We don't pin it all on God. And Rabbi Yochanan understood that instinctively, and therefore he reestablished Yavneh. What did he establish at Yavneh? Well, he established, number one, a Jewish court to replace the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. To the Romans, it seemed irrelevant. He was establishing a little court, a little seminary. But the Jews needed a court, because otherwise the Romans would have been the highest authority in Jewish life. Secondly, he insisted that what he established at Yavneh, though it might be small, had the same religious significance as the temple at Jerusalem. And he did it in an interesting way. In the year 71 of the Common Era, Rosh Hashanah, the first day of Rosh Hashanah, fell on the Sabbath. We know it because we can figure it out with our calendar. In other words, the temple had been destroyed, and then the following year, Rosh Hashanah fell on the Sabbath. Now, the Jews had an old tradition, the reasons for which it's not even worth getting into, that you blew the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but when Rosh Hashanah fell on the Sabbath, you didn't blow the shofar except at the great temple in Jerusalem. It had to do with the fear that people be caused to start carrying on Shabbat, which you're not supposed to carry on the Sabbath. So the only place where the shofar was ever blown on the Sabbath was at the great temple in Jerusalem. And now we read the following incident in the Talmud. After the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ordained the blowing of the shofar. Our rabbis taught, the year after the temple was destroyed, the new year fell on a Sabbath. And Rabbi Yochanan said to the people at the temple, to the people in Yavneh, the time has now come to blow the shofar. They said to him, Rav Yochanan, this isn't the temple. Let's discuss the matter. Maybe we shouldn't blow the shofar. He said to them, first we'll blow the shofar and later on we'll discuss it. After they had blown the shofar, they said to him, okay, now let's discuss the question. And he answered them, the shofar has already been heard in Yavneh. What do you want to talk about? During the time that the temple stood, if a person wanted to convert to Judaism, the following things happened. Number one, they were circumcised, if they were men. They were circumcised, and they had to go to mikveh. In fact, those are the two procedures that still govern conversions that are done according to halakha. That in the case of males, you need conversion. Since, fortunately, in the United States, most Jewish men are circumcised at birth, what they do today is simply symbolically take a drop of blood. Secondly, mikveh, which applies both to men and women. When the temple was standing, there was a third procedure. The converts all brought a sacrifice of a turtle dove, so to speak, to atone for their prior state of impurity and to signify that they now were entering the Jewish community. Well, what happened when the temple was destroyed? Many people said, there were undoubtedly some who said maybe we shouldn't accept converts at all because they can't bring a sacrifice. Others said, no, let's accept them. Each convert has to give the amount of money equivalent to the price of a turtle dove, which would be set aside in a special fund. Does anybody know, by the way, how much turtle doves cost today? Haven't seen any recently. But Rabbi Yochanan said, no, they're not going to have to pay money. Nobody's going to have to feel that their conversion is in any way incomplete because the temple's not standing, as if because we can't do it, we have to put aside money for it. In other words, his court was predicated on the assumption that Jewish life could function as fully without a temple. Because as he put it, we now have something that's as good as sacrifices, acts of loving kindness. Different catastrophes call forth different responses. Rabbi Yochanan's response was to teach the Jewish people, we can go on existing without a state. Even though we don't have national sovereignty in our homeland, there is no reason to commit suicide as the people at Masada did. There's no reason to go into a permanent state of depression, to not go on living in any meaningful way, to deny yourselves everything. Even without the statehood, we can go on existing. Is that an appropriate response for all time? No. I think the response of the Jews to the Holocaust was the exact opposite. When we made the realization that if we don't have a state, we're not going to be able to go on existing. When we realized during the 1930s what Chaim Weizmann had said, there are now two sorts of countries in the world, those that want to expel the Jews and those that don't want to accept them. And so the Shoah The great catastrophe elicited the response from the Jews that we needed now a territorial base to survive. Each response was appropriate in its own times. In other words, when you learn from, there's an interesting thing. Sometimes people ask, what did somebody say? A great sage who lived a long time ago. And they'll sometimes quote his words like, no matter what he said, that's exactly how we should act today. But the question, of course, to be asked is, for example, not necessarily only what did Maimonides say, but what would Maimonides say if he were alive today? Maimonides was a very great physician. To imagine, however, that all of the medical aphorisms that he gave in the year 1200 would be precisely what he would do today seems a little unrealistic. So there were instances that called forth for different reactions. And he did something else that's very interesting. He transferred the temple rituals to the home. This filled a vacuum which the destruction of the temple had created in the Jewish people. Prayers only become standardized in the time after the temple was destroyed, when Rabbi Yochanan decreed that it's obligatory every morning and every afternoon to pray, to compensate for the sacrifices that were brought every morning and every afternoon at the temple. He did not decree the obligatory nature of evening prayers because there was no evening sacrifice at the temple. Evening prayers were decreed obligatory in the century after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. But at that time he wanted to replace it. And you can imagine the effect. People knew when they were saying the prayers that they were saying them in lieu of the sacrifices that had been brought at the temple. This in turn led to the widespread use of synagogues. It was because of Rabbi Yochanan's decree that we start finding many synagogues being created all over, where Jews could get together to pray and thus symbolically reenact that they were carrying out that which was done at the temple. By the way, which in turn led to some extent to greater democratization in Jewish life. As Solomon Zeitlin notes in his history of the Judean state, at the temple the wealthier people got more covered, which of course never happens in modern temples. No, they got more covered because they brought the more prominent sorts of sacrifices. So we see a number of important innovations that came about through Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. In other words, he established a Jewish court to substitute for the high court that was lost. He decreed that the court that he established had all the authority of the temple's court, and therefore you could carry out the rituals there. You could blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah at a time just as that was done at the temple in Jerusalem. He made the Jews realize that they could survive now without a state by focusing not on the statehood and not on the God issue, but on Jewish law. He transferred temple rituals to the home and helped bring about the creation of the synagogue. Do we know much about Rabbi Yochanan's life? I'll just go on. We know very little about his life. He was one of those people who was summoned to greatness. He was a rabbi before the destruction of the temple and fairly prominent, but he was not terribly well known. You can be fairly prominent and not terribly well known in the position he had, which was the assistant to the president of the Sanhedrin. Somewhat probably like being the vice president of the United States. Who was it? One of the vice presidents who said early on at the time of the creation of the state, he said there was a woman, a mother, who had two sons. One ran off to the sea, and the other became vice president, and neither was ever heard of again. But the significance of the vice presidency was long ago underscored. I think it was by Adams, maybe Jefferson, who said, what does it mean to be vice president? Today I may be nothing. Tomorrow I might be everything. Rather more respectful attitude than that of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vice president, John Garner, the Texas Democrat who, when Lyndon Johnson approached him and said, should I accept John Kennedy's offer and run as his vice president, said the vice presidency is worth a bucket of warm spit. Now, it isn't worth a bucket of warm spit, you're right. It's not worth both of which are worth more than turtle doves. So we don't, actually not. Okay, so we don't know a lot about the details of Rabbi Yochanan's life. We know that he was a man who spent 18 years teaching in the Galilee. He lived in the Galilee, and when he came back after 18 years of being rabbi in the Galilee, what he said was, the entire time I was there, I was asked two questions dealing with Torah. and he cursed the Galilee. He really felt like a modern rabbi, who always complains that they never get asked practical questions about Jewish law. He only got 2 questions the whole time he was in the Galilee. Anyway, he was a man who used something of a Socratic method in his teaching. He had a number of students, and he said once to his students, "Go and see what's the best quality to which a man should cling." Rabbi Eliezer said, generosity, a good eye. Rabbi Joshua said, a good friend. Rabbi Yossi said, a good neighbor. Rabbi Shimon said, one who considers the consequences of his acts. Rabbi Elazar said, a good heart. And he said to them, I prefer what Rabbi Elazar ben Arach has said to what you have said, because in his words, your words are also included. We don't know much about his family life. We don't know the name of his wife. We know that he had a young child who died. And there's a story about the death of his young child that the Talmud records. He was disconsolate. He now had fallen into the very mood of depression that he had warned the Jewish people against falling into. And he apparently now went into a depression which was very severe. And these 5 disciples who we just mentioned tried to comfort him. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's son died, his disciples came to comfort him. Rabbi Eliezer entered, sat down before him, and said to him, Master, do you give me permission to say something to you? Speak, Rabbi Yochanan said. And Rabbi Eliezer said, Adam had a son who died, yet he allowed himself to be comforted. How do we know that he allowed himself to be comforted? For it is said, and then Adam knew his wife Eve again, and had another child. So too should you be comforted. In other words, you'll have another child, and that will be a consolation. Rabbi Yochanan looked at him and said, is it not enough that I grieve over my own son's death? You have to remind me now of the grief of Adam? This was no consolation. Rabbi Joshua came and said to him, do I have permission to say something to you? Speak. Job had sons and daughters, all of whom died in one day. He allowed himself to be comforted. You should be comforted. How do we know Joshua was comforted? For it is said, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, is it not enough that I grieve over my own, that you remind me of the grief of Job? And then another disciple entered, Rabbi Yossi, and tried to comfort him based on the model of Aaron, who lost his 2 sons. And he answered him in kind. And Rabbi Shimon spoke of David, who had lost a son. And he said to him, and you remind me of the sufferings of David? Then Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, the man who said a good heart is the supreme quality, a statement which he was impressed with Rabbi Yochanan, sat down before him and said to him, I shall tell you a parable. To what may this be likened? To a man with whom the king deposited an object. Every single day the man would weep and cry out and said, woe unto me! When shall I be quit of this responsibility I have towards the king in peace? You too, Master Rabbi Yochanan, you had a son. He studied Torah and he studied all of Judaism. He studied Jewish law and Jewish life. And he left this world without committing any serious sins. You should be comforted that you've been able to return your trust to God unimpaired. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me the way men should give comfort. The very last statement recorded in the name of Rabbi Yochanan is a statement recorded on his deathbed. And he said 2 things to his disciples. One, he believed in afterlife. Maybe what gave him some of the strength to go on in light of all of the suffering that he saw was he believed in afterlife. He did not meet death with equanimity in the sense that one might say a religious person would. After all, a religious person will think he'll be reunited with God. He was rather humble. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai fell ill, his disciples came to visit him, and he began to weep. And they said to him, our master, why are you crying? And he said, if I were to be taken tomorrow morning before a human king who is here today, who tomorrow is dead, whose anger with me, if he is angry, does not last forever, who, if he puts me to death, cannot put me to everlasting death, who I can persuade with words and bribe with money, I would still weep out of fear. And yet now that I am being taken before the King of Kings, the Holy One, who lives and endures forever and ever, who I cannot bribe with words or bribe with money, even more, when there are 2 ways before me, one leading to paradise, the other to punishment, do I not know, and I don't know where I'll be taken, shall I not weep? And in light then of this picture that he depicts, an odd one, because Jewish sources very rarely speak of punishment, and when they do, they say it's limited to a period of 12 months, etc. And in light of this frightening depiction of it, his final words to his disciples are so peculiar. They said to him, "Master, give us a blessing." And he said to them, "May it be God's will that the fear of heaven shall be upon you like the fear of human beings." And they said to him, "Is that all?" It starts out with such greatness, the glory of God, the everlasting King, and now all you're telling us is we should have as much awe of God as much as we have of human beings? Yet this is the man who said, when the Messiah comes, if you're planting a tree, go on planting. He's a man of ultimate common sense. If only you could attain this, that you fear God as much as you fear human beings. Don't you understand how important this is? When a man wants to commit an evil act, he says to himself, "I hope nobody sees me doing it." Therefore, if the fear of God is no stronger than that, it will keep you from committing evil acts. Many people who had boycotted Yavne during Yochanan's time also returned. He left and set up his own yeshiva. Did he react with anger, hurt? He must have. We don't know. It's a strange thing about leadership. Often people don't want it, but when they get it, they don't want to relinquish it. There was a rabbi, Rav Yoshua ben Prachya, who said, before I became president of the Sanhedrin, I would have punched anybody who would have suggested that I become president. Now that I am president, I'll pour boiling water over the head of anybody who suggests that I retire. It's a very seductive thing. But this is all conjecture. Rabbi Yochanan left Yavne, and we know of no fight. In his own generation, he was seen as controversial, regarded by some as a traitor. In the perspective of Jewish history, he is viewed as a guarantor of Jewish survival. He epitomizes in his deeds the words of Pirkei Avot, the words which to this day epitomize the obligation of every Jew living in an unredeemed world, living in a world where it's easy to become depressed and give up. Lo alecha hamalacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. It is not your obligation to complete the work, but this does not free you from doing all that you possibly can.